Hey, grade fives, this is a review of the main concepts that are inside chapter 2 in our math textbook. We're going to be talking about some decimals in this chapter. Whole numbers. Some things are usually measured in whole numbers. For example, 2 bowling balls. It's hard to have half of a bowling ball, although it is possible. But some things can be measured in part of a whole. For example, pi. I love pi. Let's say we had one whole pi and a part of a pi, 1.1. Let's just talk about place value for a second. Place value kind of means that the value a digit has is based on its place. Fives is in the one section, so it's only 5 ones. But 2 is in the thousands section, so it is actually worth 2,000. And in class, we represented different numbers using base 10 blocks. So for example, if you had 1,312, I might ask you to represent it like this. Now, decimals also, of course, has place value in that whatever the digit is, wherever the digit is, that's kind of where its value is. Now, we say ones to be left of the decimal, but the first digit to the right of the decimal is called the tenths. There's no one th. There's tenths, and then hundredths, and then thousands. In grade 5, you need to know up to hundredths. And let's talk about how you name it. A number like this, you would write 7 and 2 tenths. That's a proper way of naming it, although quickly we might say 7.2. But if I asked you to name it in words, you would write 7 and 2 tenths. Now, a number like this, you might think that it's 7 and 2 tenths and 3 hundredths, but the proper way of doing it would be 7 and 23 hundredths. Whatever the smallest unit is, in this case, it's the hundredth unit, you would say 7 and 23 hundredths. Now, you don't have to know thousands, but just to keep it in there, as a little bit of info, something like this, the proper way would be 7 and 234 thousandths is what you would say it in words, although quickly we might say 7.234. Now let's represent tenths. Let's represent decimals. In our class, what we did often is we represented whole by a square, and then we cut up those squares in different pieces. If I'm doing tenths, then I would cut up the square into different tenths. And if I was to color it in to represent it, I would color in 2 of the tenths. So this is 2 tenths. When we go to hundredth, the square turns into, we cut those tens into tenths, so you end up with a 100 grid, basically 10 by 10 grid. So if we were representing 0.23 or 0.23 hundredths, we'd start off by representing the 2 tenths, and then I'd represent the 3 hundredths. Okay, that's how you represent decimals. Now let's talk about some rounding. Rounding has a lot to do with estimating, where, look, don't give me all the details, just give me the main information about a number, and usually you might have to round off when you round, you get rid of some of the information, but you just kind of give someone the key amount that they're looking for. So when you are rounding, sometimes we round up and sometimes we round down, and different things happen when we do either one. This is the way I've been asking you to do it. I usually say, first of all, look at the place value target. So what that means is, if they say round to the tens, I would look at the tens number. If they say round to the hundredths, I look at the hundredths number. And then whatever the target value is, then you evaluate the digit, the number that's to the right of that. So let's take a look. Let's round this to the nearest 10. So because it's nearest 10, I'm going to do something like underline the 10 to let me know that this is the number that I'm really worried about. And what I do then is I evaluate the number to the right. So this number to the right is a 5. Now, if it's 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, we say that's rounding down. And if it's 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, we say that's rounding up. And when you round up, that's the only time that the digit, the 4 in this case, is going to change. Now, because the 5 is in the rounding up department, that means that the 4 changes into a 5, and we end up with a 0 in the ones department. I'm not going to go into that too much more, but I'm going to move over now to rounding with decimals. So this time the same kind of idea applies. I'm going to round to the nearest tenth. So that means I'm going to underline the 10th number, and I'm going to evaluate the number to the right, which is the 5. So in this case, the 5 is in the rounding up category. So I'm going to change the 4 into the 5. Here is something very specific about decimals. When you round up like that with decimals, you don't usually leave the 0 in the hundredth section. So instead, you don't write 16.50, you just stop at 16.5. So that is an interesting thing to note about rounding with decimals. With whole numbers, you would add those zeros to the numbers that get rounded, but in the decimals, you don't add additional zeros. You just kind of leave it out. Let's take a look at another decimal number, but this time we're going to round to a whole number with a decimal. So let's say I'm going to round to the nearest tens. So where's the tens? It's not tenths, it's tens. So the tens would be the 1 in this case. And so I evaluate the 6. The 6 is in the rounding up department. So what happens is the 1 is going to change into a 2. And it just ends up being 20. And I get rid of the rest of the decimals. So that is a rounding of a whole number. When you've got decimals, the decimals are going to just disappear in the end. So here are some other key concepts in this chapter I didn't really talk about. One of them is writing numbers. For example, let's say you had 167, you would write 167. And to be accurate, between the 67, you would put a hyphen. Also, I might ask you to, we talked about a little bit in this review about writing decimals in words. And there's also a small section at the end of the chapter that was on adding money. Anyways, those are, for the most part, most of the key concepts in chapter 2. Good luck.